Hey everyone, welcome. Today we're simplifying Darktable. We're going to focus on a clean UI and a straightforward workflow. We'll set up a minimal interface, and then I'll show you how to handle each step, like exposure, contrast, and color, using only one dedicated module per adjustment. Let's dive in. Go to the Settings tab at the top right here, and go to the Processing tab. Then make sure you select Scene Referred Sigmoid. Sigmoid and filmic are both scene-referred workflows, and Sigmoid's simpler to use, but basically what both of them do is they map the data from the scene, which is what your camera saw, to the display, which is what you see on your display. We will be doing little tweaks in Sigmoid, but for the most part you could even not touch the Sigmoid module. It's just meant to translate that data. Also in the Processing tab, the CPU and memory. This will allow Darktable to use all the resources of your CPU and GPU. And so make sure you select large for Darktable resources, activate OpenCL support, leave scheduling profile at default. Obviously this is assuming you're only using Darktable while you're editing, but this will allow it to work most efficiently. Under the miscellaneous tab. And it's called Mouse Wheel Scrolls Modules Side Panel by default. When you click this, it allows you to scroll on these side panels rather than your scroll wheel affecting the sliders. I find it very unintuitive when you're not able to scroll like this, so I recommend having that setting on. Go to the darkroom view, which is where we'll actually edit photos. And we're going to modify this user interface here to be much cleaner and easier to digest. Modify the workflow, which is what they call these groupings of modules, each individual item here being a module. We will go to this hamburger menu right here, and you'll see scene referred as the default. So instead you're going to click Manage Presets, and from here what I think is the easiest way to do this is to click Duplicate. And now you'll be able to make your own custom version of this. And in this custom version, you can add module groups, you can remove them, you can move the groups left and right, and you'll be able to add and remove individual items by clicking them there to remove them, and you can add them by going here and selecting any module and being able to add it back in. What you're going to want to do is follow along. I already have my workflow set up. I called it Workflow Custom. And you'll want to just modify the scene referred workflow that you just created and try to match it to what I have here. It should give you a much more organized and purpose-built workflow with no extraneous modules. I'll be getting into each of these items, these modules, as we do our edit, but for now what you'll want to do is just copy these settings. So I have three groups, one called base, and you'll add highlight reconstruction, hot pixels, denoise profiled, lens correction, chromatic aberrations, rotate and perspective, exposure, tone equalizer, crop, and color calibration. Next, in the color grading tab, you're going to have sigmoid, color balance RGB, color equalizer, and RGB primaries. And finally, in our creative tab, we'll have framing, grain, contrast equalizer, this will be used for clarity, diffuse or sharpen, retouch, and haze removal. Now that we have our module groups set up, you can close this window and go back to the hamburger menu and then select the workflow that you've just created. Keep in mind that as you move through these tabs, you might sometimes accidentally double-click one, and that will show many more modules. So don't get confused, just click it again, and it'll go back to the way you have it set up in your workflow. Before we begin editing the photo, I want to set up these corrective modules, such as hot pixels, denoise, lens correction, and chromatic aberrations, as default modules that are applied to every image, as well as this preset, and I'll go into presets in a second to enable these defaults. but there's a preset called Basic Colorfulness Standard on Color Balance RGB. So all of those I'm about to set up as default modules. What we're going to do is make presets for each of the modules that we want to apply as defaults. So if you click on Hot Pixels, and you right click on it or click the hamburger menu, you can click Store New Preset. From here, you can just call it default. In this case, we're not modifying the actual module. And you click Auto Apply this preset to matching images. And as is, when you don't change anything here, it'll apply to every image. I like to disable non-RAW so that this doesn't apply modules to my JPEGs if I happen to be cropping them in Darktable. So I just click OK. And then now we do the same thing for Hot Pixels denoise profiled. So just again do that. And the reason we're doing this again is to make sure that every time we open a new image, we're not going to have to go and enable all of these corrective modules. So last one, chromatic aberrations, default, auto apply, click non-raw. And then lastly, again, I like to have this color balance RGB basic colorfulness standard preset. So it's already a preset that you right click and it exists. You click that. And then you'll store a new preset, which is essentially a copy of this preset. Again, I call it default, and click auto apply and non-raw. Yep. So now all of these will apply to any image moving forward. So if I go to a new image that hasn't been touched before, you'll see that in the history stack, which I'll go over in a second, these default modules have already been applied. So I don't need to already select lens correction since we enabled it as a default. The last thing I'd like to cover before we get into editing the photo is the history stack. This is just a representation of all the changes you have made separated by module so far. So if I make a change to exposure, for example, then you'll see it appear in the history stack, and I can actually undo it by going back here, or you can click Ctrl-Z. And if you ever for some reason want to remove an item from the history stack, you would have to go back and then click Compress History Stack. What this actually does is remove everything after it, but it also compresses modules together. So let's say I made a change to exposure and then, I don't know, apply crop, and I actually go back to exposure and make another change, you'll see there's two instances of exposure here. Compress History Stack will essentially, if you don't go back in history, which will remove things above where you are, if you click it, it will put all the exposure changes all together as one history item. Another important thing to know is that if you want to reset everything you did to the image, so take it back to its defaults, which now include our default modules, you'll click this button here. And this reset button is present in every module. So you can reset the exposure module to what it was by default. And the history stack is also a module. So you can reset it and it will put everything back to the default state. The final important note I have right now about the history stack is the fact that you can also take snapshots of the history stack. So let's say I made a change and I wanted to compare that change to something else in the history. I can take a snapshot and then go back to some other point in history and click on my snapshot right here, the large part of it, and it'll let me show a comparison between the two things. In this case, you can see the lens correction and exposure are different. You can also click this icon here to restore the history stack to the state of the snapshot. So that, in this case, just puts us back up here. But if I had made many other changes, right, and I push this, it'll undo those changes and go back to the state of this. And to turn your snapshot off, you just click the same button that you did to turn it on. And finally, you can also reset your snapshots, which removes them. At this point, we're finally ready to begin editing our image. So we'll go ahead and reset the history stack again. And the first step we will take is managing our exposure. So what I like to do is click this little light bulb icon, or you can use Command B on Mac, and use that as a reference point, this white border, to control my exposure. As you can see, if I make it like this, it's definitely too bright compared to the white, so I think somewhere around there looks pretty good. Next, while our white border is still active, I like to do the white balance corrections. So to do that, we use this color calibration module. It might seem complicated at first, and if you see other tutorials, there's lots to it. But I find most of the time, if you just have it at the default, it will determine what the illuminant is. So in this case, it recognizes it as daylight rather than some custom illuminant. And I will just use the slider that it gives me. And there are alternative ways to use this. For example, you can click this white balance picker, and it will actually do an average of the whole image to determine what it thinks the white balance should be. In this case, I actually like it a lot more than what it gave me by default. And you can also select a specific neutral part of the image to choose your white balance. So actually, and this has been my favorite iteration so far. So then once you are happy with the color picker, or if it gave you this by default, where you have a hue and a chroma, I find that the hue it selects is often very accurate, as long as you chose a neutral area or the image selector did a good job. And so what I'll do is pretend like the chroma slider is basically the temperature slider. So if you add more of it, it will counterbalance the hue that it has selected. So as you can see, if I go less, it actually looks more like this hue. And more I go, it kind of adds like a purpley blue, which is opposed to this yellowish hue. So I will find a balance that I like. I think this is a little too blue, so we'll go back a little bit, maybe like that, and I think that looks great. Now I'm going to remove this white border, and I'm going to show you the crop and rotate and perspective modules. So the crop module works as you'd expect. You can select it, and then from here you can choose a different aspect ratio. So you can keep the original aspect ratio and the crop will maintain that. You can make a freehand one, so you can have a custom crop, or you can choose one of these presets. So in this case, 4x5, since it recognizes this image as a portrait image, it's giving me 4x5 here. But if you ever wanted to swap it, now I can have 5x4 with this rotate button here. And lastly, to actually apply your crop, in this case, I think I will go with a 4x5 crop because I want to sort of center my subject in the frame. Then I will actually select the module again, just like we did to open it, and it will apply the crop. And remember that any item, any module can be turned on and off with this on and off button. Next, there's the Rotate and Perspective module. I actually love this part of Darktable, and it can be used in many ways. Even if you're not selected on the Rotate and Perspective module, you can actually right-click and draw a line anywhere on your image, and it will actually rotate it based on the line you draw. So if I want to align on those stairs, I can do it that way. If I want to make this vertical line the aligned value, I can do it like that. And my favorite way to use it other than that is to open the module, and you can click on this Analyze Line Structure in Image. It will find the number of horizontal and vertical lines. In this case, it's clearly more of a horizontal line heavy image. So you can then apply an automatic perspective and rotation using either this for vertical perspective and rotation, this for horizontal, or this for both. I usually try to keep to just one of these two, and I personally don't like perspective shifts that sort of change flopping the image left or right or back and forth. So what I like to do is actually, if you mouse over these automated vertical and horizontal ones, there's an option to control click it to only fit rotation. So in this case, it has more horizontal lines. I'd like to use the horizontal rotation, and I'll control click it, and it will give me a very nice rotation based on the stairs in this case. And I really like that. Now, before I move on, I actually want to reduce the exposure a little bit. I think I went overboard. The next thing I want to cover is how to recover shadow and highlight detail using the tone equalizer module. Now, this module essentially acts on a mask. So if you look at the Advanced tab, which is really where the curve to make changes is, this has its own little histogram here, which is actually different than this histogram. It's the histogram representing the mask, and you can control that mask's exposure placement, which this puts it in the middle, or you can increase its contrast, which essentially, and you can preview the mask here, essentially increasing the contrast allows more room in this histogrammed version of the mask to make changes. So that's how you'd control the mask manually. The other important thing to note here is this preserve details setting. This is what determines what the mask actually looks like, what type of mask is used. So if you click no, you'll see it sort of just looks like the real image because there is no special mask being applied on this to preserve details with. So if you were to use this no setting, this is best for applying contrast, but we're going to do that in a different way in this workflow. In today's workflow for tone equalizer, we're actually going to use the EIGF, which preserves details. This isn't good for contrast, but it's good for getting details back from low shadows or high highlights. So I have found with lots of testing that without even needing to adjust the mask, most of the time you can just right-click this module and go to this compress shadows and highlights EIGF soft setting, and it will automatically control your mask to a reasonable degree and lift your shadows and lower your highlights. And from here, I find you can sort of just tweak it to get more information out of the shadows or more information out of the highlights. And if you go too far, obviously like anything, it'll look weird. And another great thing you can do is you can actually mouse over the image and scroll either up or down. So let's say I want to increase these shadows, I can scroll up, and the highlights on the face might be a little much, so we'll just reduce them. As an example, I actually think this image isn't the best example, so I'm not really going to apply this module, but I wanted to cover it because it is important, and this is how I would recover details. So again, lastly, I'm just going to reset this module and actually turn it off. And we will now move over to the Color tab. Now, in the Color tab, we're going to have these 4 modules. And sigmoid is something we'll cover later, but the main module that matters here is Color Balance RGB. This module is going to be used for both saturation and contrast in my simple workflow. So you'll see on our basic colorfulness standard preset, which comes by default with this module, which again, you'll have to right click and go here to access. It already applies some saturation. So if I turn this on and off, you'll see some saturation being applied, and it applies more to the shadows and less to the highlights. And that's because applying saturation to the highlights doesn't look as natural. So I'm going to reset this back to here. And the saturation sliders allow you to split between shadows, midtones, highlights, and global. And what it really does is adds both color saturation and contrast, as in it'll change the luminance or the brightness of these colors as it adjusts their colorfulness. It'll actually darken the colors. Whereas the chroma sliders, I don't personally use, but a lot of people like them, they will increase the colors without changing the luminance. And finally, my favorite one is this global vibrance slider, which is basically used to increase saturation in low saturation pixels. So generally, most of the time, I like leaving perceptual saturation grading as the defaults that come from basic colorfulness standard. And I'll usually just adjust the vibrance to my liking. And obviously, if it's not enough, I can go with here the saturation grading sliders. But most of the time, it looks great, and I think in this case, it looks really good. So the next step in the workflow is actually to apply contrast. So just like everything else in Darktable, there's a million ways to provide contrast. My favorite and the easiest I find is actually these perceptual brilliance grading sliders that are in with color balance RGB. And as you can see, this is one of the most powerful modules of Darktable, and we'll be doing even more in the 4-ways tab later. But for now, you can actually just reduce shadows, increase highlights, increase midtones, decrease midtones. You can really have pretty fine control over your contrast this way. And I think in this case, the shadows need to be reduced a little. I think the highlights are probably good. It'll look a little too much if I go up with the highlights. But I think it'd be nice to increase the midtones in this image. Maybe just a touch on the highlights. And another important part of the contrast is actually in the 4-ways tab. And again, we'll do more in the 4-ways tab, but in regards to contrast, there's this global offset luminance slider. It's confusing, like a lot of things in Darktable, the names aren't very clear, but really this is according to Boris, another creator, really a black level slider. So you can increase and decrease your black level with this slider. So I think in this case, if you want a filmic look, you can kind of increase it. I think in this case, just slightly decreasing it actually looks best. The next important thing regarding contrast is actually the sigmoid module. And at this point, I'm going to talk through what scene referred and display referred really means. Because Darktable is, at least in the current iterations, built to perform on the scene referred space. So if you go to this tab, it shows you your active modules. And really the modules are applied from bottom to top. So what sigmoid and filmic RGB are really tone mappers that take the luminance values, the exposure values, from the darkest parts to the lightest parts of your camera's scene data and map it to the display data that we see here. So everything before sigmoid on this active module section, because as I said, it applies from bottom to top, these are actually all scene referred modules, which work in the space sort of before that display transformation. And sigmoid, what it does is that tone mapping. Same with filmic RGB, and you'll only use one or the other. So even though it's a tone mapper, sigmoid is also really great by getting a good contrast straight out of the box with not even any changes needed, honestly. As you can see, we already had good contrast. If I turn off sigmoid, it sort of changes how the image looks, but you always want to have a tone mapper on. And if I compared it to filmic RGB, they'll look different by default. And you can kind of see if I take a snapshot of filmic RGB and I go back to sigmoid, and again, these are the bare defaults of these modules. Generally, it's easier to get a good result out of sigmoid just from the start. And so sigmoid is on the right, filmic is on the left, and this is usually why I like starting and using sigmoid over filmic, because even with no changes, I find it gives better contrast and easier results. Okay, so if I disable the snapshot, and we actually open sigmoid, you can see there's a few sliders in here, a lot of sliders actually, but really the most important thing is this contrast and skew slider. And also, we'll get into these, but if you start changing the contrast slider, you'll see you can really make adjustments to how you want the contrast to look. Like let's say you wanted more contrast and the color balance wasn't doing enough. You can increase it here. In this case, I think I liked how it was, but just keep in mind that this will also increase saturation as you increase the contrast. The skew slider allows you to either move the contrast towards the highlights or towards the shadows. So usually what I do is play with these a little, see what looks good after I've already done my base level contrast and color balance RGB. And then same with the skew, and I think in this case just a little bit towards the shadows looks good. Then there's this preserve hue slider. Other creators will have really in-depth videos on sigmoid, but usually the way I do it is I sort of increase and decrease this and see what looks best. In this case, I actually like how it looks when it preserves the hue, maybe a little bit less. And these target black and target white sliders, They are similar to that luminance slider I was showing you for black level. So you can kind of control the black level here as well, and the white level. I'll leave them by default. And then these sliders, these primary sliders, are actually a very interesting and useful way to control your saturation in the highlights. So this attenuation slider, each one, blue, red, green, blue, has an attenuation slider. These are really is adding white kind of to the reds. So you can see it sort of desaturates the reds in the highlights specifically. So I think it actually looks a little better with some. And then the rotation also modifies the hue just very slightly, only in the highlights again. And so same with blue. If I increase it all the way, you'll see it sort of desaturates / whitens out this blue here. And a lot of the time it looks a little more natural. If you don't want to mess with these sliders too much, there's also this nice preset called Smooth, which actually does apply some of that by default and looks pretty good generally. Now, I usually just keep it at the default and just tweak things, however they look good. Okay, now that we've handled our contrast, it's time to get into creative editing, really. And I'll start with color grading. So there's two amazing modules here for color grading. I usually start with RGB primaries, as it kind of is broader strokes of color changes. And then color equalizer will let you manage individual colors and their hue, saturation, and brightness. So what RGB primaries is really a simplified channel mixer. So you can actually just change the hue of reds, and it's actually also affecting the blue and green channels. We can kind of shift it towards magenta or shift it towards yellow for red. In this case, just the slightest bit to magenta I think looks pretty good. And you can also increase the purity, which is essentially the saturation level of the reds. Same with the greens. You can shift them towards yellow on the left or cyan on the right. So if I was to go to the right, it's sort of going in line with what I did on the reds. And with the blues, same thing, but cyan on the left, and on the right is magentas. So again, I think I like that look of teal. So in a lot of my images, I'll shift it a little bit to the left. There's a lot of blue in this image. I think if I increase the purity, it might be too much. We might even want to decrease the purity just slightly of blue. The last slider here, it's called Tint Hue, but as I've learned from Boris and many others, one in scene referred space, because technically you can move these modules around, though I don't recommend it. So generally what this actually does is changes your white point, the value of your white point to have these tints. So really this is just modifying my whites to be a little more blue in this case, or more orange, but effectively it looks like it's, touching your whole image. It's just a little more nuanced than that. Next is the color equalizer module, which is honestly extremely powerful. It has some nice pre-built presets like Portrait 400, teal and orange, things like that. But you really want to learn how to use it as is. So again, you can modify all of these colors and their hue, saturation, and brightness. Another way you can use it, other than this graph right here, is by middle clicking here, and you'll get sliders, though I haven't found a way to do this with a trackpad. So for the sake of this guide, if you don't have a mouse, I will actually use the chart. And so what I usually do here is I start with brightness, and then I move to saturation, and I rarely adjust hue because I like to keep the colors sort of how I set them in RGB primaries. But you can do that if you wish. You can make the reds a different color or anything you like. And so in the brightness tab, you can change, either blues can be dark or bright. And another really useful thing for using this module is when you go up here, I had it set to histogram, but I actually just in general use this waveform, by the way, for my exposures. But this very left one is called vector scope, and it has a few different views. Usually I think it's defaulted to this. And this kind of gives me a great reference to what colors I actually have in my image. Clearly in this one there's more blues and a little bits of orange, probably here on the walls, right? So it kind of gives me an idea of what colors to really focus on. Another thing that's important to know is you can take this dropper and place it somewhere, and it sort of tells you, if you're looking at the graph as I move the dropper, where those colors lie on the graph. And here, as you can see, if I wanted to modify this, I can't actually access that exact spot. So you can move the nodes here to specifically modify that spot of color and make it brighter, darker, increase saturation, decrease saturation, right? And this is a good time to note that you can also create multiple modules, instances of any module, by clicking this button and click New Instance. The reason I find this useful for color equalizer is, let's say, again, I specifically wanted to modify that section of the wall, but I still want to use the color equalizer to make some broader strokes that are on the original node placements. You can do that by just using a second instance of the module. So I'm actually still only going to use one instance in this case. I can click this button, and by the way, you can right click it to make a new instance. I'm going to click the button, delete that, and go back to my single instance, and I'm going to reset it. And I think in this case, I actually want to emphasize the blues, so I'm going to increase the brightness just very slightly of them. The oranges, I'm not sure how much I want to change. I think it's good as is, maybe even tiny bit because the hair on the subject gets emphasized. And then, a tiny bit of saturation on the hair there. And I could probably even do with reducing some of the saturation on the blues, because if I go up, it'll definitely not look natural. So maybe let's reduce it just slightly. And I think that's good for my color equalizer. And again, you can turn them on and off like this. Now, the last part of color grading that I want to go through is split toning, which really means modifying the colors in the shadows and highlights and midtones. A lot of other programs use color grading wheels for this, but we use color balance RGB. And like I said in the color equalizer section, you can actually make a new instance. And I like to do that, even though you could use the same instance. That way I have one that controls my saturation. You can even have a third one that you do your contrast on, though I generally just do it in the same one I do my saturation on. So this can control that. And I can have this new module where I just go to the four ways tab and control my split toning. Okay. So now we can go and we can actually just add a hue, choose the hue that you want. So let's say a little bit of, maybe some orange will do well in this image on the shadows. Not too much, because as you can see, it makes it very strong, but I think I'll add just a little bit of blue or oranges in the shadows. And maybe just a slight bit of yellows in the highlights. You can, yeah, just to add to that daytime view. So yeah, that looks pretty good. I think it might be a little strong, and we might even want to change the shadows to be kind of bluish. No, I think I liked them orange here, so we'll go with that, but we're going to reduce it so it's not too much. And to do that, again, you actually just use this chroma slider to increase the amount, and the hue slider to choose the color. These luminance sliders are similar to the perceptual brilliance grading ones, though they seem to have a smaller scope of what they consider to be highlights, and they also have a smaller amount of effect. So I generally don't use them for contrast. And finally, you can set something in the midtones. I think maybe just some new colors in there, some pinks maybe, just slightly, not too much. Maybe that's too much. And you can see we have some creative color grading going on here. I think I'm actually going to reduce my highlights just slightly, because I think it might be a little overdone. If you go here, you can look at the face. So we'll just keep it as that. Now we're going to move on to this last tab, the Creative tab. And the reason I named this Creative is because I use this tab for my grain. If I wanted to add some grain, which by the way you can zoom in by middle clicking or scrolling. So you can add grain here, and you can also add your sharpness and your clarity here. So starting with sharpness, I think my favorite way to use sharpness is this diffuse or sharpen module. There's many other ways, just like everything in Darktable. It's a really complicated module. There's much better videos from other creators going in depth in it. But really, there's all these great presets. And after all my testing, I found this Sharpen Demosaicing AA filter. Does a great job applying natural sharpness. If you look at the face here, you can zoom in even further. It really does a good job not over sharpening on almost everything I've ever tried. On the stairs as well. Really just a natural level of sharpness I think looks good. And this is a good time to talk about masking. I'll get more in depth into this in a bit, but you can always, on every module, almost every module, apply a mask by going to this bottom section, either choosing to apply a drawn mask that only affects this instance of this module, parametric mask, which allows you to select just blacks or just whites, so this is just selecting the highlights by removing blacks, or the opposite by removing whites. I can select just the dark areas of the image. That's what a parametric mask is. It can also be combined with a drawn mask. So in this this second to last tab, so let's say I just wanted to affect my shadows, or actually more reasonably, because we're doing sharpness, let's just affect the highlights or not shadows, right? So I can do that, and then I can pull it back to feather it just a little bit, maybe a little more. You can, this top slider and bottom slider affect how feathered it is on top of this feathering radius right here. So you can see that'll blur the mask just a little bit more here. And then you can also add a drawn area. In this case, this shape. You can also draw other shapes, and it's a combination of our parametric settings plus whatever I've selected with my drawn mask. You can change the size of the mask with actually by scrolling, or you can use these. And this is a feathering radius that can also be controlled with the mouse, or you can shift scroll to control that. Another thing you can do is hold Control, and you'll be able to rotate these shapes. Okay, so let's say I just wanted to sharpen my person and not in the shadows of them. I forgot to mention that to display the mask, you would actually click this button right here, this next to this blend mask. And that actually shows me what I'm masking, right? So now, if I was to use this sharpening, it's actually only going to affect this person. And I just want to cover that with the mask on, just to make it easier. While you have your shapes on, you can click this pointer to either show or hide the shapes. You can also delete a shape by right-clicking it. So now my drawn mask is gone. It's gone back to the parametric mask. And another very useful drawing tool is either the brush, which you can control the size again by scrolling. So you can just sort of brush. I only want the mask to be around here, right? Or I'm just going to Control Z. Or this drawn path, which allows you to select a path by each click sort of determines the path here. So I can do like that, and then when you right click, you're finished with your path. And you can also feather this same thing, just like a drawn shape, by using the shift scroll. So there are actually way better masking guides from some other creators, which I'll link to the people I've learned the most from. But I think if you look at Boris's videos or Bruce Williams' videos, they cover masking in a lot more depth. So I just wanted to give you the basics here. But another really useful thing you should know about masks is that any module that has them also has this uniform mask option, which doesn't display the mask because the mask is just flat across the whole image. But what this is really useful for is, regardless of what you do on a module, without needing to go and touch all the sliders and everything again, you can reduce the opacity, which reduces the effectiveness of that module instance. In this case, again, we apply sharpening. So let's say it was too much sharpening, but you don't need to understand this complex module. We're just using this preset, right? you can go to this uniform mask and actually reduce the amount of sharpening that this is doing. So if I go all the way down, you'll see, and I double click it, which resets the slider, you'll see a pretty big difference in the amount of sharpness. I mean, if you go all the way, it's completely removing it, but you can kind of control the opacity by doing this. So I'm actually going to remove the mask because I want the sharpening in this case. And I want to move on to one of my favorite modules, which is contrast equalizer. This module is used for clarity, the clarity slider in Lightroom. It has a confusing name and it looks complicated, but there's a really simple way to use it. If you just right click it and click clarity, you'll see it's kind of increased all this whole section here in the graph to be all raised up a little bit, this coarse and fine section. If you go back to this clarity, it increases all of them just a little bit, which is actually what the clarity slider in Lightroom is doing. It's increasing the micro contrast across the whole range of coarse and fine details. And of course, in this case, it looks too strong. You can see if I turn it on and off, that's a lot of clarity, right? But without needing to adjust this, you can just use this mix slider to increase or decrease the strength. So if I just want a tiny bit of clarity, you can do that with this. Or if I want a little more, you can go like that. And even negative clarity. So you can just go like this, and as you can see, it's affecting what's on the graph. If I mouse over the graph, it'll show me the actual values. But if I reduce it further, you can see it's bringing it down on the graph. And you can get negative clarity like this, which is actually my preferred form of clarity. I like having softness in my images, so this is a great way to do that. But of course, this being Darktable, since we have the flexibility, it's good to know how to use it. So you can reset this, and you can actually, again, increase clarity in certain areas, like just the coarse areas, or just the fine areas. This is really adding sharpening by increasing clarity in a, micro contrast in the fine details. You're increasing sharpness. Or, you can do it somewhere in the middle, you can increase or decrease it. So you can even apply like negative clarity to the image without affecting the sharpness. And so it makes it a really powerful module that I really love using. The final style creative edit I like doing is this diffuser sharpen. I make a new instance. And again, there's lots of presets here, and I really like the bloom preset. Again, it's way too much if you just do it on its own, right? If I zoom in, it's just too much. But it gives a great diffusion effect, right? So what I do is I'll click that bloom preset, and I'll go to the uniform mask and reduce the opacity of it till it looks good. So I think I still want it to have a little bit more of an effect than that, maybe like that. And if I turn it on and off, you can see it really applies like a really beautiful glow to the image. Yep, turn it on and off. Maybe it's a little much, so we'll reduce it just a little bit more. And now just to get into these final few modules, there's the Haze Removal module, which does what it says. If there's haze in the image, it removes it, and it sort of increases contrast by doing so. And you can actually also go the opposite way and add haze, which does a really good job making like a bit of a dreamy look, right? You can turn it on and off and see. I actually think it looks pretty good in this case, so I'll leave it. Next, I want to cover the grain module. It's pretty self-explanatory. You just turn it on. Default usually looks pretty good, but you can change the coarseness and the strength and midtones bias, though I usually don't touch that one. Yeah, so I think I'll decrease the coarseness a little bit here and the strength. Just some very mild grain I think would look good with this image. Next, there's the framing module, which you can select here, and it'll allow you to turn any image into any aspect ratio regardless of crop, right? You can increase and decrease the border size here. Another important thing to note is you can choose the orientation, so landscape. So it's, even though this is a portrait image, I can give it a landscape border, and I can actually choose the aspect ratio. So let's say I want it to be 16 by 10 or go to 16 by 9. This is now, a landscape image essentially, just with a big frame around it. And so you can sort of play around with mainly these two drop downs, this orientation drop down for portrait and this aspect drop down for the aspect ratio that you want. You can click image to keep the original. And the border size. Those are really the main sliders that are important on framing. And last but not least, there's the retouch module. And I usually don't use this very often, though I found the best way to use it is really leaving it on this healing tool and then choosing a shape of something I want to remove. So I'm not sure I'm actually going to do this for this image, but let's say I want to remove these people, right? You can kind of just select an area. And let's say I want to just get rid of this person here. So using this drawing path tool, I can select around them. And what it'll do is then choose an area. This was a terrible example because there isn't really an equivalent area to remove this person with. But you can choose the area that you want to remove something with. And let me try to give you a better example of something small. Let's say for some reason I want to remove this little post here. You can give a circle and you can use the scroll wheel to control the circle size and the feathering of the removal. And so let me say I want to move this just a little bit, get a little bigger, and then you can kind of control what you want to replace it with this circle. In this case, I would choose something like that to keep the shadow there. And then if I remove it, you see, I kind of removed an area. Didn't do a good job because, you can probably tweak it more, make it either more or less feathering. I think less feathering, so it's more exact on this area. Kind of reduce the size here, and that should be a little bit better. And I kind of move this to line up better. Yeah, that should line up better, and something like that. But I'm not actually using it for this image. Just know that that's how you would use it. I'll turn it off. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about before we finish up will be two things. One, creating a style, which a style is really a grouping of presets. As we saw, that each module can have presets. A style is basically a way you can apply everything that you've done to one image to another image in a repeatable saved fashion. And then also exporting your image as a JPEG. In regards to creating a style that we can reuse on other images, and you would use them, by the way, by clicking down here on this little button, and I have some styles already, but what a style really is a collection of presets on your modules, and it's built by using a history stack. So usually I found it best to compress your history stack so that it puts everything that you've done into a single instance of each of these modules. So I'll do that, and you see I have less history, but everything is in an individual instance of a module. And then you'll click this button right here, which says Create a Style from Current History Stack. Then usually what I'll do here is I'll click Select None. We'll say New Style, right? And you'll see all these bottom ones are sort of things that are already applied to your images, especially some of these that we created as defaults, right? And color calibration, this is our white balance, so I might not want to apply that to every image past this, right? So you'll selectively include what you want to be as part of your style that will get added to the history stack when you apply the style. And so in this case, I don't really want any of these. I don't really want to apply sigmoid either, but these are the creative edits that I did that make sense to really, in this case, put in a style. And you can also have it reset a module that you're including in your style to default, right? But in this case, I don't want to. I want my changes to be saved to a style. So I'm going to include the RGB primaries, the color balance changes I did, the sharpening, the clarity, the haze removal, grain. This is kind of a filmic style at this point, I guess. And the color grading I did here. And And then you always want to click this module order right there as well. So, let's just say like filmic, right? You can save this as a style. And then now if I go to another image that, I can reset this other image. And then you can click down here at this bottom left and go to your new style and it'll apply it. Maybe. Need to do it again. So it'll apply that style. So, it might not translate perfectly for this image, but it added the things from that style to my history here. So we can try it again on a different image. Go here, reset the history, and add our new style. And this kind of edited this photo, with the same effects kind of that we put on this one, right? Now, if you want to edit a preset, I haven't found the most straightforward way to do so, but I think that the only real way to do it is by going to a new image, resetting the history, applying your style, okay, and then make changes to the image however you want, right? Like let's say I want exposure being higher as part of this style, for example. Then after you're done making changes, try to save a new style again, and then select everything again that you want to be as part of the style. And you'll have to save it under the same name. So I called this new style -filmic. So as I create this, I want to go here and select everything that I actually want to be part of the style again. So let's go starting from contrast equalizer, because that's actually used in, not one of the defaults. And add all of these. And then remember, we want exposure now to be in our updated style. And then, again, new style -filmic is what I called it, right? So this is how you'll really update a style. Click save, and it's going to say style already exists. And so overwriting it, by doing so, now if I reset this, I have my updated style here that now includes exposure. Another thing to note about history and styles and copying edits is if you go back to the light table, and this is your view of other images, again, everything is really history based, right? So if I don't want to create a style, but I do want to copy my edits from one image to another, let's say they were all from the same day or event, right? You can click on your light table, this history stack module on the right, select the image that you want to copy everything from. So you click copy here, or you can selective copy, similar to a style. And then you can go to another image, and usually I would discard the history of that. And you can either overwrite or append items from the history. In this case, I'll overwrite because I just want to take everything from here and click this and click paste. So obviously it does not look good on this image, but you can see that I copied the edits from this image and applied them to this one. Another important thing to note is that Darktable is actually creating sidecar files, little tiny files where it stores all the edits on. So these are all raw files, and in a second we'll export them to JPEGs. But these two versions of this in the duplicate manager, and I could duplicate it again, duplicate the same edits, or create another copy of the original. So it's one way you can see the difference other than snapshots. And all these duplicates, they're not copying the raw file. It's just another sidecar file that Darktable maintains, and it's very small. And finally, we're going to cover exporting our image to a JPEG. You can do this both in Darkroom and Light Table. On Darkroom, it's on the bottom left, the export module here. And just like any other module, you can save presets. So after you customize this to your liking, you can save it as a preset. So if you ever accidentally touch it, you can go back and click your preset. Again, the same exact module is at the right side of the Light Table view. And the only difference here is you can select multiple images to export all at once. So I will go back to the darkroom since we focused on this image. And under export, I like to choose just a folder. So I have this export folder. So regardless of where all my edits are, I always have the same export folder just to make it easier for myself. And then I believe I leave everything else on default. So I just I have changed this, and the only other thing is I reduced the quality to 90%. I did testing and it looks just as good, but is a much smaller file size, though you can leave it as is or increase it. And the only other thing I change is these two things. So I change high quality resampling to yes, and profile to sRGB, just to make sure that, you know, I'm exporting web safe every time. And then you click export or Command E. And now the photo's done exporting, so I can just go to my export folder and see it here. It's now a JPEG. You can use it however you like. And that's it. I know it was really long, but I hope it was actually simplified compared to maybe some other guides and information out there. It's certainly better than starting from nothing, I think. Yeah, please give me any feedback, and I'm really glad if this helped you and you watched this far. Thank you so much.